Welcome to the Monday Morning Mixtape, a podcast featuring some of the best music that you know and introducing you to other music that you should really know. On this week's show, we're going to be talking about the history of chiptunes, recommending some artists that you should listen to if you're into it. Then in the middle of the show, we're going to be talking about some of the best soundtracks to video games that you can listen to at the moment. And then, if you want, stick around for the end, and I'm going to give people a little bit of advice on if they're interested in making some chiptune music, some of the hardware and software that they can use. So, stay tuned. So I'd just like to say thanks to everyone for listening so far, and all the people that listened last week to the things. Hope you're enjoying the show. Obviously it's a work in progress and it'll develop over the next while, so kind of like to do something a little bit different this week, because we're probably going to talk about metal or hard rock or guitar based music more than anything. We decided to venture into, I suppose, a bit of electronic music. Later in the show we're going to be talking about some of the best soundtracks for video games. And then as well, we're going to get into the whole thing about equipment that you can use to make chiptune music or 8-bit music. But let's get started with the show. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of chiptune music and how it developed into what it is nowadays, and some of the artists that are, I suppose, big with it. Pioneered it. That's the word I was looking for. Well, yeah, I suppose for people, there's one of the things when you go looking at the chiptune music that you're going to come up with is that it's, a lot of people don't think of it as being a genre of music. It's I suppose more an aesthetic, more so than anything, because it's used in loads and loads of different kind of like settings. It's like, I mean, obviously it started off in video games, but it's used in pop songs. There's a lot of hip hop artists who are after sampling different kind of like, chiptune tracks or 8-bit tracks from the likes of Mario, and Zelda seems to be a very popular one that was sampled a lot. But then you got it's people, it just mixes into everything. But I suppose where the term chiptune came from was that for people to get that 8-bit sound originally, so I suppose a little bit behind the tech with it before we get going. And then when kind of like it came out at first, the early computers, they only had, they didn't have a sound card on them or a dedicated chip thing. So what used to happen was it could only make a beep, beep. That was the only noise it could make. And they couldn't have music playing when a game was playing at the same time because it just take up too much of the CPU. So people developed sound chips that they could use, which they'd only have, they're basically like the same chips that were in synthesizers at the time, but they could only cope with, I think it was the Nintendo had 5 channels on it, but one of those channels was for sampling, which it never really used, but you could hear it in, say, the likes of Super Mario 3, where they have the steel conga drums. The other 2 ones, they could handle a square waveform. So they use those for the leads with the beep, 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 beep for that bit. Then there was a triangle, which was used for the bass a lot of the time. Then there was a noise channel, which was the explosion. And if you ever loaded in an old Spectrum game or an Amstrad game, that was what made that noise.
You'd be very familiar with that noise,
Well, anyway, it needed a dedicated chip to send it. So if anyone's familiar with MIDI controls, what MIDI controls does, it sends out the signal for the sequence, and that's basically what coders used to do. So with early games, which was really, really amazing as well, was the guys that were making the games were the ones that made the music as well. They weren't musicians, so they'd program in like a sequence of zeros and ones and zeros, which then would be sent from the computer main thing to the sound chip. And then that would make the sound. So in a weird kind of way, it was playing it in real time. So when you were playing the game in the 80s, it was really like, it was a live kind of set, I suppose.
A live soundtrack almost,
to a certain kind of like degree.
It's almost harking back to like sort of the old-timey pianos being played in a cinema hall.
Yeah, it was. And there was a little guy in kind of glasses inside your computers. But like, for some reason Nintendo, because it was one of the things, they all had different channels and they all had different chips, so they all had their own unique sound, and it's one of the things that's missing from computers nowadays, I suppose. that when all these they were in direct competition with each other. So you had like the Commodore 64, very, very different game. Well, not very different games, but looked very different. The graphics even on it. So even compared to like the Amstrad 464, compared to Nintendo, and compared to Sega, and it was the same with the sounds. Sega had, I think, more channels for the Master System compared to the Nintendo. So that was, if anyone ever listened to the Streets of Rage 2 soundtrack or Streets of Rage, it's more kind of synthy, kind of like stringy, I think, kind of vibe to it. Whereas with Nintendo, it has more of the bleep bloop. And I think the Commodore 64, a lot of people seem to reference that sound chip as being very, very important. And then Commodore did the Amiga, and I think that sound chip ended up being used in Yamaha keyboards as well at the time, when as they got more advanced. Well, it was basically just the start of the whole thing. And then I suppose what started happening was that there was a thing called the demo scene with early games. So people that were, I suppose it's similar to kind of like, it's one thing, anyone that's ever after pirating any kind of like software.
Not that we've ever done that.
Well, see, some of the keygens that you get, that kind of harks back to the demo scene. So people program in their own little chiptune thing, their own little 8-bit bit to it, which kind of like goes back to that. But the demo scene started, like I remember in the 80s, when I had the first personal computer, there was a lot of people trying to make their own games, because nearly a lot of them, when you bought a computer at that stage, it came with a fucking manual the size of a brick, and or it's thick as a brick, and it'd tell you how to program.
Yeah.
So if people were really interested, you could teach yourself how to program
Basic
games.
coding, yeah.
Yeah. Like I think it was with the Amstrad 464 came with a thing how to make solitaire, I think it was, or maybe it was blackjack or one of those things. I remember spending hours programming it and it didn't work. So
I had a really
with
terrible experience with this stupid game. It was like almost like a 20 questions kind of game with the Sinclair Spectrum, and it was like called Blancmange.
I remember that. Yeah,
do you remember that?
Yeah.
It would ask you a load of questions and like, is it Blancmange? And I was like, no, when is it ever going to be Blancmange, for God's sake?
Can you save me from myself? No. Can feed me people. But the demo scene was going on, and then I think in the 90s that seemed to evolve then into more of a thing where there was artists and musicians coming together, and they used to put together these like either tapes or on discs of music that they were making themselves in games and sharing it around. And then by the early 2000s, and people started meeting up, and then kind of like all these different kind of like festivals or kind of like cons started coming up around the chiptune music, the 8-bit music, because a lot of people, I think they saw it as more of a challenge to be able to do, and that's what it seemed with a lot of people even today. It's the limitations that are put in place. But where it seemed to have really exploded was when the Game Boy came out. I can't remember, I think it was in very, very early 2000s, a guy created basically fucking a program that you could use called, was it Little Small DJ, I think? Little Sound DJ. Sorry, that's what it was called. You could flash it and put it onto one of your cartridges and put it into your Game Boy and turn it into basically a sequencer. That you could use the sounds and use the chips. Now, a lot of people use it today. This is kind of like where it goes. So basically, then you can sequence it up, put in the little tunes that you're going to play, and you can use, obviously, the first two kind of like, square kind of waves to kind of come up with your tunes, and then kind of like use the rest for drums and bass. And that was really I think when chiptunes started getting big. Now, a lot of people still carry on with that, and they use, say, the chips from the original NES or from the Mega Drive or the Genesis, as they call it over in the States. And people use a lot of these different chips, and they can circuit bend. I'll talk about circuit bending later on, but it's basically where you could take something like, what was it, like
child's toy piano?
Yeah, child's toy piano, and kind of like fuck around with it and turn it into a big synth. But people are doing it where they're mashing like different chips together into instruments to make chip tunes. So kind of like, I suppose the thing in the 2000s, there was like, a flurry of these things, and then it started becoming more, well, not mainstream, because it's still very underground, because there was a very punk ethos to it.
Yeah.
Where people would meet up with these
kind of a thing,
things, and kind of like they'd share their music, but some people got fairly big from it. I'll talk about some of the artists later on, but one person, I suppose, Disaster Pieces, if anyone's familiar, I think he did the music for Fez, But he ended up doing, where I came across him at first was for the soundtrack to It Follows, which was an amazing soundtrack. But yeah, it did Fez and Bit Trip Runner 2 and Hyper Light Drifter. But you had people like that kind of like came from, and some of the earlier guys went on obviously to bigger things where it started like coming into like advertising, and then people doing video game music as well, because there was like a second. If people can kind of remember the birth of indie games, like you'd remember, even though you weren't playing it, there was an indie game, the movie, showing all these guys. So a lot of these guys went back to that aesthetic, whereas like 8-bit games, more complex than the original ones, and they had that 8-bit thing, and people went crazy for it, and then a lot of people kind of went into it because I suppose it's not that it was easier to do, but it was, I suppose, it's easier to do than kind of like fucking make Call of Duty.
Yeah, it is, and it just has that retro appeal as well. A lot of people have that kind of nostalgia tinted kind of thing for it, you know.
And then kind of like, you know, I suppose it kind of died off a little bit more then again. Where it's still just kind of like, you know, part of music, I think now, with it. And of course you got like, there's different genres, but there's different kind of like, you know, things. There's people kind of bit chips, I think was one of the things that it's called, where it's more of a high tempo, kind of like, you know, fun, kind of like, think kind of, I suppose, anime, kind of like, oh, hi. Kind of, that sound racist? I didn't mean it. But maybe I did. But then there's, it's fake bit, where it's, I suppose, what most of the music is now, where it's people kind of like emulating the sounds, like using other synthesizers. But it is one of the things which I'll get into later on. You don't need like a Game Boy or one of these things to create 8-bit music, because those ones, they're based on very, very basic synthesizers, very, very like the most basic synthesizers that you can get. But yeah, I suppose that brings us to today, and like, I mean, the whole thing is, well, if you look back at the start of stuff, there was always like certain bands that were using. I think one of the first bands to bring in the whole thing about say sampling music was a Japanese band called damn, I can't find them on my pieces of paper.
Your little scraps of notes that you've just like written down everywhere.
But yes, I suppose kind of like one of the Yellow Magic Orchestra was a Japanese group who they use samples from Space Invaders, Circus and Gunfight on some of their things. But as well, like, I suppose getting into kind of like recommended artists and some of the pioneers. There was one kind of like a soundtrack that keeps coming up, even when we're looking for the game soundtracks that we'll be talking about later on. Soundtrack to RoboCop 1 and RoboCop 3 seem to be classics. And it was like this guy called Jonathan Dunn who did the RoboCop soundtrack for the Game Boy and Platoon game. I remember playing Platoon as well on the Amstrad 464, and I loved it. It was like kids playing, killing people. But he's and Jaren Tell, I think, who did RoboCop 3, but they were definitely kind of guys who did an awful lot. They expanded the thing. One of the first guys, actually, as well, who did an awful lot of work, mainly for Nintendo. He did Silver Surfer soundtrack and Ghouls and Ghosts. And I don't know if anyone remembers Echo the Dolphin on Sega. It was a guy called Tim Follin, and I think he ended up having something to develop in chips as well, but he was very kind of prog rocky with some of the stuff that he was into. I think as well, another guy who kind of, when it started off at the early 2000s with the Game Boy stuff, was a guy called Bit Shifter, Josh Davis. He's well worth checking out. I think he's still making music, but like, he was featured in the Rolling Stone magazine and everything. He's one of his albums, I think it's called Life's a Bit Shifter.
That's Bit Shifter. Yeah. Your accent makes it sound something entirely more
maybe I must
risque.
have to do it. Null Sleep is another one. He's like very, very big. He got very big, and he ended up covering a lot of the different festivals and stuff. And if you type in chiptune, you're going to come across Anamanaguchi, which are a fairly big band. The mixture of guitars and kind of like, normal kind of music with like synths and NES audio. They are fucking massive. If you look at them on YouTube, they've got like hundreds of thousands of millions of views. And then I suppose coming kind of more modern ones, Shovel Knight soundtrack. When we're talking, that's one that I forgot as well by a guy